Some of you may have seen some of the online interviews that I've been doing, learning with my rabbis. I've been getting to interview some of the teachers I've had, the mentors, the people who've helped shape my rabbinate. We're now in the second season. It's a continuation from last summer. And there's one teacher so far that I've had on twice, Rabbi Elliot Dorf. And I think one of the reasons is if there's one teacher I've learned from the most from, it's certainly him. He was the advisor for my capstone project. All throughout rabbinical school in multiple classes, we had long conversations, and we've continued them since, both off camera as well. He just celebrated his 50th year as professor at the AJU. He's written dozens of books and articles, served as chair of the Committee of the Jewish Law and Standards for decades now. But of all the things he's taught me, there's one lesson that wasn't in a book, it wasn't in a tshuva, it wasn't in a lecture. It wasn't even when I went to him with a big question or a problem I was facing. It was in an ethics class that he taught. I, the young, uppity rabbinical student, wrote a paper for his ethics class about his tshuva on same-sex marriage. And what I wrote was that his tshuva was unethical, that his tshuva was immoral because it didn't go far enough. Going again to what a mensch Rabbi Dorf is, I got an A. But I also got an important lesson when we were sitting in his office one day afterwards. Don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. In truth, it turned out he agreed with most of my criticisms of his paper. He knew that a more permissive position was the right answer, but he also knew that at that time and place, a more permissive decision would not pass the committee. And he knew that to make a stand for the perfect instead of the good would push the opportunity back for years, if not decades, for same-sex couples in the conservative movement. And it's perhaps one of the most important lessons I've learned in rabbinical school and in life. And as I continued to learn, I've realized that it's not a unique lesson. There are many other rabbis who believe the same way. You might not be surprised to learn that there are rabbis who agree, who propose shortening the Rosh Hashanah Musaf service. They want to remove the individual recitation of the Amidah and solely have the group one, the leader's repetition. And the reason being is that it takes too much time and people get distracted and they start to talk. And ideally, in a perfect world, people would recite both the prayer and quietly follow along during the repetition. But the reality is that people don't. What might surprise you, though, is not that rabbis proposed this today, but that the Rambam, Maimonides, proposed this nearly 1,000 years ago. It wasn't some liberal, no-name rabbi, but one of the most acclaimed Jewish thinkers throughout history. Even though it goes against the halachic practice, he believed it's better that the service maintains decorum than it follows the law and becomes too much for people to sit through. Almost 1,000 years ago, Rambam understood that tefillah, prayer, must adapt. It must be made accessible to the people who it's intended for. He got it back then. Why don't we get it today? In another ruling, fascinating to me, he argues that Jewish prayer in general has to be shortened in this tshuva. And the reason he gives is that the non-Jews believe it's the custom for Jews to talk in synagogue because the service is so long. And for the sake of it, he doesn't try to change the people. Instead, he wants to change the service. He gives up the ideal for the good. There's a dangerous idea in the Jewish world, and it seems to assume that Judaism is meant to be difficult. If you're not giving things up, if you don't feel burdened, then you're not practicing Judaism correctly. If you make Judaism too easy for people, it's not really Judaism. But the truth is that Judaism isn't meant to be overly complicated. It's not meant to be overly burdensome. Yes, there are limits. Yes, it is not always easy to be Jewish. But there are ways we can and should make it easier and more accessible. And again, this isn't some new age idea. It comes straight from the Gemara. When discussing Sukkot, there's a debate among the rabbis as to which plants Which species make up the arba minim, the 4 species we're supposed to take with the lulav? And 2 plants are suggested, but are outright rejected by the rabbis. Not because the rabbis have a tradition that these certainly aren't the case, but because these plants are thorny. And to the rabbis, it's inconceivable that the Torah would require people to take hold of a plant that would prick them. Drachecha darchei noam, her ways are pleasant ways, is what they cite. I was once at a community Passover Seder, and there was an Orthodox family attending with their non-Orthodox relatives. The father of this family was a Baal Tshuva. He became Orthodox later in life, and he rejected the watered-down conservative Judaism he grew up with. He was very, very outspoken about this throughout the week. And I remember one of the ways he made clear was he brought his own horseradish to the Seder. He didn't want the sweet, tasty, mild horseradish that everyone else was using. He wanted to really feel the bitterness of slavery with full force. Well, I remember distinctly the face he made as he ate it, biting into a big chunk, the water he drank and drank, protesting that it wasn't so bad and that it was the correct way of doing things. I remember that years later when I read a tshuva of Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, who ruled very clearly one should not use raw horseradish. Why? For the same reason. Drachecha darchei noam, her ways are pleasant ways. The Torah does not want us to suffer. Judaism is not always easy, but there are limits. It should not be painful. Jews love to tell other Jews what to do, whether it's members of one denomination looking down at another, whether it's members of one synagogue looking down on another more lenient synagogue of the same denomination, or even members of the same shul, or even members of the same family. And it makes sense in a way. It is a deoraita, a biblical mitzvah, commandment, to rebuke your fellow, to tell them when they're not following the law correctly. And yet, despite the status of this mitzvah, the rabbis ruled that it's even more forbidden to rebuke someone if it will cause them embarrassment. It's even more forbidden to rebuke someone if it'll push them further away rather than bringing them close. Citing a verse from Mishle, a verse of lower legal status, the rabbis limit the biblical commandment because there is a greater good for them, a greater good. Sometimes the perfect gets in the way of the good. So why am I sharing all of this with you this morning? I think it's essential that we ask this question, that we remember not to let the perfect get in the way of the good. There's a lot of talk going on lately about our future, about what Beth Tikvah will look like a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, decades from now. It's part of a larger question about the future of conservative Judaism. Our numbers are shrinking. Not just Beth Tikvah, but more and more Jews are leaving Judaism altogether. And more Jews are not affiliating with synagogues. And the trend seems particularly strong among conservative synagogues, especially when you look at the United States. And there's talk now in Toronto about the need for conservative synagogues to start to merge with each other. They say there are too many conservative synagogues for too few conservative Jews. I get it. If you have fish in a bucket and there is a leak, you need to get more water in there fast, or those fish are going to die. And if you have 2 buckets of water, dump one into the other, and it'll buy you some time. It's important. But the problem with that solution is that it's just temporary. Unless you find a faucet, unless you find a way to constantly bring more water into that bucket, or a way to plug the leak, you're eventually going to run out of buckets of water to keep adding. The good news is, in this analogy, the water represents Jews. And in Toronto, there are a lot of them. This is the city with the largest Jewish population in Canada. It's growing year after year. There is a faucet ready to be turned on. We just have to be willing to turn it. In the 2018 survey of Canadian Jewry, 1 in 5 Jews answered that they are not at all or not very connected to Jewish life in their city. Of them, a quarter, 25%, said they want to be more connected. That's tens of thousands of Jews who want to be more connected to Jewish life. It might surprise you, but 4 out of 5 Jews polled between the age of 18 and 34 say they want to be more connected to Jewish life in their city in Canada. Even if, as some have told me, they're lying on the survey, even if we assume half of them are liars, that's still tens of thousands of young Jews who want to be more connected to synagogues and Jewish life. They want to be involved. So why aren't they? There's a lot of talk right now about how we need to raise money. We need to make memberships at synagogues more affordable. But I'm not sure that that alone is a solution. In fact, when you look at the data from the polls, only 3% said that price, the cost, financial reasons, was their barrier to participate in Jewish life. More than twice that number answered that they just don't know people in the local Jewish community. They need somebody to reach out to them. Meanwhile, another 30%, they offered reasons that amount to they don't feel Jewish enough to participate in the synagogues and organizations in their city. This category is made up of Jews who said they don't feel comfortable with the local community. They went and they didn't find it accepting. They didn't feel a part of a community because of their other culture, their family history. Making synagogue membership affordable is a noble goal. It is a good goal, but it's a fraction of the number of people who simply don't feel comfortable, who don't feel welcome going to synagogue. I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of starting with the big problems first. I'm not saying we should change everything about us. I'm not saying we should make drastic changes at all. I think our community is really great. I love our tefillah, I love our prayer service. I love our traditions and our customs. And it would be amazing if every single Jew felt the same way that I do and you do about it. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to not let the perfect get in the way of the good. I love a service that's in Hebrew, a service that follows the traditional nusach and liturgy. Knowing it, I can walk into any synagogue in the world that uses it, and I can feel right at home and comfortable. And in a perfect world, every single Jew would have the knowledge to do the same. But again, the world isn't perfect. More and more Jews today don't have those skills. They can't just walk into a synagogue and know what's going on. So maybe it would be okay to add some more explanations. Maybe it would be okay to add a prayer or two in English. I know that in our virtual minyan this past year, when Irv added an English reading to the morning service, for many people who came and were not regular attendees, it was a 1 minute of the service that they knew what was going on, that they were able to connect to. And it gave them the comfort to come back many, many times, enough times to become comfortable with the rest of the service. Maybe it would be okay to do one less warm-up from Pesukei to Zimra, the pre-morning service, and add a 2-minute teaching about a prayer in English. A prayer so that over time, we can all learn new meanings, new ways of connecting to the traditional liturgy in the Siddur. I agree with the Rambam. In an ideal world, everyone would focus on every single word of the Siddur. But I also agree with him that we don't live in an ideal world. And maybe it would be okay to make some changes. Maybe it would be okay to have a small area in the back of the sanctuary with quiet toys where kids could play, so that parents who come with young children don't have to choose. Are they going to participate in the sanctuary service, or are they going to go downstairs to the basement because their kids are becoming a distraction to others, because their kids have nothing to distract themselves? Maybe it would be okay to have a shelf in our sanctuary, a shelf with accessible books about Judaism, about prayer, about the Parsha, about Jewish ethics, Jewish philosophy, about customs and law, so that adults who come in and can't follow along in the Siddur of the service can learn and grow, and someday find meaning in the service, but at least in the immediate moment, find meaning here on a Shabbat morning. In a perfect world, we wouldn't need any of this, but the world isn't perfect. The truth is that for many, many Jews, prayer is not a meaningful experience. It takes time to develop the skills and abilities it requires. And maybe it'd be okay if in 2021, prayer was not the main focus of a synagogue. I'm not saying a synagogue shouldn't have a daily minyan. Shouldn't have services on Shabbat and holidays. But after all, a synagogue is not called a Beit Tefillah, a house of prayer, but a Beit Knesset, a house of gathering. Maybe it would be okay if we also focus on creating other ways for people to learn to connect with Judaism, ways for people to gather and connect with each other. The Federation here in Toronto just released a survey a few months ago about intermarried families in our city. We can pretend it doesn't exist, but the trend is growing whether we like it or not. Whether or not we would choose for it to be in a perfect world, we don't live in one. The study, however, is fascinating, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. Over 50% of interfaith families in Toronto say they want to be more connected to the Jewish community here in our city. And the factor that inhibit them are, again, a sense of being comfortable, a sense of being wanted. They hear their relationships, their families spoken about negatively from the pulpit. The non-Jewish partner, despite showing up, something more than many Jews do at synagogue, feel pressured each and every time to convert, whether by the rabbi or by congregants. Even the Jewish partners have said they feel as if they are treated as less Jewish because of who they married. Maybe it would be okay if letters from the synagogue asking people to pay their membership dues, to give us money, were addressed to both the Jewish and non-Jewish spouse. Maybe it would be okay if we acknowledge the reality that exists. Maybe it would be okay if their marriages were recorded in the synagogue's database and they received a phone call from their rabbi on their anniversary. 1 in 3 millennials have boycotted a business they usually shop at this past year. This is how millennials think about the world and think about change. They don't want to support organizations that don't share their values. So maybe instead of lamenting that young people don't want to come to the speaker we have or the program we have, we should ask, what program, what speaker do they want to hear? In a perfect world, every single Jew would follow every commandment. Every Jew would belong to a synagogue, but we don't live in a perfect world. I know I'm far from perfect. I imagine I'm not the only one. But that's the problem with one way of thinking. We see it in our Parsha today in the story of Pinchas. Pinchas the Zealot. When someone violates the rule, what does he do? There is no place for them in his community. There's no place for them in his society. There's a tradition, interestingly, which is the reason why the usual Haftorah that is read with Pinchas is about Elijah, that the prophet Elijah is actually Pinchas. And that the prophet Elijah, the connection being that the Elijah of Malachim, the Elijah of the book of Kings, is not the Elijah we sing to at Havdalah, the Elijah we welcome on a morning bris to sit with us, the Elijah we welcome to our Passover Seder. The Elijah of the Torah is a zealot. He says it himself, Kano kineti ladonai. I am zealous for the Lord. There's a midrash which plays on the famous scene of Elijah up on the mountain after he flees. God asks him, what is he doing there? And he replies, I'm zealous for the Lord. The Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left, and they're out to take my life. The Midrash teaches that God wanted him, instead of accusing the Israelites, to beg for mercy on their behalf, like Moses would have. So God gives him some time, lets him calm down, waits for cooler heads to prevail. But what does he say again? I am zealous for the Lord, and the people are sinners. It is then that God tells him he has to pass on his position as prophet. It is not okay for a zealot to be a prophet. A zealot cannot lead the people. Because if the people are to be held to a perfect ideal, it'll be impossible. The Jewish people are not perfect, and they can't be led by someone who expects that they will be. If so, there is nobody left. It is a zealot who lets the perfect get in the way of the good. Being Jewish isn't always easy, but we can make it more accessible. We can put it in reach of people. The Rambam understood that. It should not be difficult or overly painful. The rabbis of the Gemara understood that. We have to too. There are countless Jews who are not perfect. They want to be included. But if we expect them to just walk in the door of our communities, to suddenly just fit in one day, If we wait for that, someday there will be nobody left. We have to reach out a hand. We have to meet them and raise them up rather than push them down. There is a faucet in our city waiting to be turned on. There are shuls around North America that are doing incredible things, shuls that are growing when others are shrinking. We can keep pouring buckets of water into each other, but if we don't find the faucet, one day we're going to run out of buckets. Shabbat shalom.